The first rule of zero-G is that everything floats, blood included. I learned that the moment our lead scientist's teeth sank into the pilot's neck, sending a crimson cloud of gore expanding through the cabin like some grotesque nebula. We were falling to simulate space, but the only thing we were falling towards was the end of the world. The first rule of zero-G is that everything floats, blood included. I learned that the moment Dr. Eris's teeth sank into the pilot's neck, sending a crimson cloud of atomized gore expanding through the cabin like some grotesque nebula. One perfect ruby-red sphere followed by dozens more, each one a silent testament to the end of my world. We were 30,000 feet in the air, falling in a controlled parabola to simulate the weightlessness of space. But control was gone. The plane was bucking, alarms screaming a symphony of our doom. The metallic tang of blood filled the recycled air. And Eris? Eris was pushing off the ceiling, his movements impossibly fast and utterly silent. A predator in an environment he was suddenly, terrifyingly born for. My name is Dr. Kenji Tanaka, and this is the story of how my research into saving lives ended up documenting the end of all of them. Just 10 minutes earlier, it had been the greatest day of my scientific career. We called the KC-135 the Vomit Comet, a less than flattering but accurate name for a flying laboratory that could induce nausea in a statue. For me, it was a cathedral. For 90-second intervals, as the plane crested its parabolic arc, we were free from gravity's tyranny. My team and I were on the verge of a breakthrough in cellular regeneration. We were studying a unique extremophile microbe designated X19, recovered from the core of the Murchison meteorite. This thing was a biological miracle. In a zero-gravity environment, it acted as a catalyst, triggering latent regenerative abilities in damaged tissue samples at a rate we'd only dreamed of. We watched, mesmerized, as severed muscle fibers rewove themselves in their petri dish, floating before our eyes like threads of life being spun by an invisible hand. Dr. Eris Thorne, our lead biologist, was ecstatic. He was a brilliant man, but ambitious to the point of recklessness. "Think of it, Kenji," he'd said, his voice buzzing over the comms, his reflection warped in the glass of his helmet. "No more spinal injuries, no more degenerative diseases. This is the key to everything." I was more cautious. The microbe was an alien life form. Its mechanisms were still a black box. We were poking at something we didn't fully understand, and that always made me uneasy. "Let's get it sequenced before we plan the parade, Eris," I'd replied, my voice a flat line of caution. He just laughed. During our final parabola for the day, Eris was handling the primary sample. There was a minor turbulence jolt, nothing unusual, a coffee cup rattled in its holder. But a seal on his containment glove, a microscopic tear we'd missed in pre-flight checks, chose that exact moment to fail. A tiny, almost invisible droplet of the X19 culture breached containment, hanging in the air for a split second like a rogue star before the cabin's filtration system could catch it. Eris inhaled. He didn't even notice. He just blinked, shook his head, and continued his work. None of us knew that we had just started a clock and that it was already seconds from midnight. It was a simple accident, a 1 in a billion chance, the kind of thing that starts an apocalypse. The first sign was subtle, a tremor in his hand. He blamed it on the coffee. Then came the sweat, beading on his forehead and floating away in tiny, perfect spheres of saline. He complained of a headache, a sudden, blinding migraine that he said felt like ice picks behind the eyes. I suggested we abort the final ascent and get him checked by the onboard medic, Sarah Jenkins. She was a former Air Force pararescueman, calm and competent. As she unstrapped to float towards him, Eris began to seize. It was violent, horrifying. His body, untethered by gravity, thrashed wildly in the center of the cabin, a puppet in the hands of some invisible demon. His back arched at an impossible angle, the fabric of his flight suit straining. We could only watch in horror as every vein in his neck and face bulged, turning a deep, bruised purple. Then came the scream. It wasn't human. It was a high-pitched, guttural shriek of pure agony and rage that overloaded our comms with static. And then, silence. His body went limp, floating. We all held our breath, thinking the worst was over. Sarah, ever the professional, moved closer, her medical kit in hand. "Eris, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice calm despite the tension gripping the cabin. She reached out to check his pulse. The moment her fingers touched his neck, his eyes snapped open. They weren't his eyes anymore. They were milky white, devoid of reason, of humanity. There was only a terrifying primal hunger. He moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible, his hand shooting out and grabbing her wrist. The crunch of bone echoed in the suddenly silent cabin. And that's when he bit the pilot. Chaos. There is no other word for it. In zero gravity, there's no up or down, no running, only pushing. Every surface is a floor and a ceiling. When the co-pilot, Henderson, a good-natured man who'd shown me pictures of his kids that morning, turned to see what was happening, Eris, now a creature of pure instinct, launched himself off the pilot's corpse. He flew through the cabin like a projectile, a silent, weightless horror. He hit Henderson with the force of a car crash, and the sickening sound of teeth on bone echoed again, a gruesome percussion to the blaring alarms. The plane, now without a pilot at the helm, dropped out of its controlled parabola. We went from 0G to a gut-wrenching 1.8G dive. We all slammed into the floor, the force penning us down, driving the air from our lungs. Loose equipment, laptops, tools, our precious samples, everything rained down on us in a deadly shower. A heavy microscope narrowly missed my head, shattering against a bulkhead. The infected, however, seemed unbothered by the sudden gravity. Eris and the two pilots, already turning, their skin paling to a waxy gray, began to crawl, their limbs twisting at unnatural angles. Their movements were spidery, jerky, like broken marionettes. The X-19 microbe wasn't just reanimating them, it was optimizing them for this new, violent existence. It was a sci-fi horror narration come to life. I scrambled backwards, my mind struggling to process the nightmare. My scientific brain was screaming about pathogens and prion diseases, but my primal brain was just screaming. Sarah, the medic, was writhing on the floor, a horrifying transformation taking place. Her groan was wet, guttural, as black veins spiderwebbed across her face. I knew I had seconds. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could reach, a fire extinguisher bolted to the wall. As the plane began its next ascent, the autopilot fighting its own death throes, the gravity lessened. We started to float again. This was my only chance. The infected were disoriented for a moment, their Earth-based instincts fighting with their new weightless reality. I used it. I aimed the fire extinguisher at the now zombified Sarah as she lunged for another researcher, a young grad student named Ben Carter. He was brilliant, terrified, and barely 24. I didn't spray it. I unclipped it and pushed with all my might. It was basic physics. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The heavy cylinder flew across the cabin, a silent red missile, and struck her square in the chest. The impact sent her careening into a bulkhead with a sickening thud. She wasn't dead, not in the traditional sense, but she was immobilized, her spine clearly severed. It was a temporary reprieve. Ben was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with terror. "What's happening?" he screamed, his voice a thin, reedy thing. "The sample," I yelled back, my voice hoarse. "It's airborne. We're all infected." The terror in his eyes was replaced by something worse, dawning, hopeless realization. He looked at a scratch on his arm, a minor injury from the fall. A network of black veins was already spreading from the wound, pulsing with a life that was not his own. He was out of time. I had to be ruthless. I had to think. The cabin was compromised. The cockpit was compromised. The pathogen was in the air filtration. This entire plane was a flying tomb. My only hope was the cargo bay. It had its own sealed environmental systems. I pushed off the wall, launching myself towards the rear of the plane. The original infected, Eris, saw me. He pushed off the ceiling, his trajectory a perfect intercept course. There was no time to think. I saw a discarded tablet floating nearby. I grabbed it and threw it at a side panel, hitting the emergency release for the oxygen masks. They dropped from the ceiling on their yellow cords, a sudden dense forest of plastic and tubing. It was just enough. Eris's trajectory was altered as he collided with the dangling masks. He became entangled, flailing wildly like an insect in a spider's web. It bought me the 2 seconds I needed. I reached the hatch to the cargo bay, my hands fumbling with the heavy locking mechanism. Behind me, I could hear Ben's final, agonized scream as it devolved into a wet, inhuman gurgle. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I slammed the hatch shut, turning the heavy wheel until it locked with a final, definitive thud. I was safe, for now. Plunged into the near darkness of the cargo bay, surrounded by crates of scientific equipment, I could only listen to the muffled bangs and shrieks from the other side of the door. The apocalypse story had begun, and I was its first prisoner. The relative silence of the cargo bay was a torment. It gave me time to think, and thinking was the last thing I wanted to do. My team was dead. Ben, Sarah, Aris, Henderson, all gone, transformed into monsters by my life's work. The weight of that guilt was heavier than any gravity. My research had just unleashed a plague, and I was trapped in a metal tube plummeting towards the earth. The plane was flying erratically now, a wounded beast. Sharp banks, sudden drops, and terrifying climbs told me the infected were in the cockpit, mindlessly bumping the controls. Occasionally, the intercom would crackle to life, broadcasting not words, but a cacophony of snarls and wet chewing sounds. It was a direct feed from my own personal hell, a constant reminder of the horrors just a few feet away. I had to do something. Staying here was a death sentence. The plane would eventually run out of fuel or tear itself apart, and I'd be a smear on the landscape. The cockpit was the only answer. Maybe, just maybe, I could regain control, or at least point us towards somewhere unpopulated. The ocean, a desert, anywhere but a city. I found an emergency kit and strapped a small oxygen tank to my back.
The air in the main cabin was poison. I found a heavy-duty crowbar in a toolbox. It wasn't a weapon, not really, but its solid weight in my hands was a small comfort. Taking a deep, filtered breath, I cracked the seal on the hatch. The sounds from the cabin rushed in, louder now, a symphony of the damned. I peered through the gap. The scene was a charnel house from a nightmare. Bodies, and parts of bodies, floated in a grotesque ballet, suspended in the intermittent zero-G. The walls were smeared with blood that had dried in strange branching patterns. And my former colleagues, my friends, were now just things. They were gathered towards the front, drawn by the blinking lights of the cockpit. This was my chance. I had to move during the zero-G phases. I waited for the lurch in my stomach that signaled the start of a parabola. As weightlessness took hold, I pushed through the hatch, moving from handhold to handhold along the ceiling, trying to stay above the floating horrors. One of them, Ben, noticed me. His head snapped up, jaw hanging slack, a string of saliva connecting his chin to his chest. He pushed off the floor, launching himself at me with a silent, hungry scream. I swung the crowbar in a wide, desperate arc. In zero-G, it was slow, clumsy, but it connected. The impact on his skull was dull, unsatisfying, like hitting a bag of wet cement. It didn't stop him, just sent him spinning off into a bulkhead. I didn't wait to see if he'd recover. I pushed forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached the cockpit door. It was closed, but I could hear them inside, snarling. There was a small, reinforced window. I looked through. Henderson, the co-pilot, was slumped over the controls, his body mindlessly pushing the yoke forward, sending us into another steep dive. Reese was behind him, clawing at the armored glass, his white eyes locking onto mine. There was a flicker of something in them. Recognition? No, just pure predatory hatred. I had to get him away from the door. My eyes darted around the cabin and saw it, the emergency release for the main cabin door. It was a terrible, insane idea, an act of pure desperation, but it was the only one I had. I scrambled over to the lever, my magnetic boots clinging to the wall. Aris saw what I was doing. He started banging on the cockpit door, a frantic, thunderous rhythm. He knew. Somehow, the thing inside him knew. I pulled the lever. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening roar, the cabin door blew outwards. The world became a vortex of wind and sound. Explosive decompression. Everything not bolted down was sucked out into the sky. Bodies, equipment, loose panels, all gone in a hurricane of freezing air. I held on for dear life, the wind tearing at me, the noise of physical blow.
The sudden pressure change shattered the cockpit window. I saw Eris get sucked out, his body tumbling into the blue abyss, his white eyes fixed on me until he was just a speck. For a moment, I felt a surge of victory, but it was short-lived. The plane was now open to the elements at 30,000 feet, and it was structurally compromised. A terrifying groan echoed through the fuselage as a stress fracture raced across the wing. The long fall had begun. I crawled into the cockpit, fighting against the screaming wind. The controls were dead, the screens dark. I was no longer in a plane. I was in a uniquely shaped brick. I strapped myself into the pilot seat, my knuckles white as I gripped the useless yoke. All I could do was watch the ground rush up to meet me. I closed my eyes and thought about my family, about a world that was, in all likelihood, already gone. Consciousness returned not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent assault. The world was a symphony of pain. Every inch of my body screamed. The taste of blood and jet fuel filled my mouth. My ears rang with a high-pitched whine, the ghost of the aircraft's death cry. I opened my eyes. I was still strapped into the pilot seat, but the seat was no longer in a plane. It was at the top of a mangled heap of metal, wires, and broken composites, surrounded by the splintered trunks of pine trees. The entire front section of the KC-135 had torn away and plowed a massive, smoldering furrow through a dense forest. By some impossible miracle, my section, the cockpit, had remained relatively intact, a metal egg that had cushioned the final, brutal impact. I unbuckled myself, my body protesting with a fresh wave of agony. I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my side. I had definitely broken a few ribs. A deep gash on my forehead was bleeding freely into my eyes, blurring the hellish landscape. I stumbled out of the wreckage, my legs unsteady. The silence was the first thing I noticed. It was profound, unnatural. No birds, no insects, just the faint crackle of burning electronics and the whisper of wind through the trees. It was the sound of a world holding its breath. It was late afternoon. The sun was casting long, ominous shadows through the forest canopy. The world I had left behind just hours ago was gone. This was something new, something terrifyingly quiet. I scavenged what I could from the cockpit. A survival kit with a medical pack, water purification tablets, a flare gun. My hardened drive with all the X-19 research was, miraculously, still in my pack, undamaged. Then I saw it. Lying near the main wreckage, thrown clear from the cargo bay, was the body of one of the Air Force security personnel who had been accompanying our flight. And next to him, a standard-issue M4 assault rifle, its strap tangled around a broken tree branch. Several magazines of ammunition were scattered nearby in the dirt. I had never fired a gun in my life. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It was heavy, cold, and felt utterly alien. But in this new world, I knew, my knowledge of cellular biology was worth less than a single well-aimed bullet. As dusk began to settle, I saw a faint glow on the horizon, beyond the trees. A city. But the light was wrong. It wasn't the steady, warm glow of a living city. It was a flickering, angry orange, the light of 1,000 fires. That's when I heard it, the first sound to break the silence. A low, guttural moan coming from the main body of the wreckage. Then another, and another. They were waking up. The things that hadn't been sucked out of the plane during the fall. The crash hadn't killed them. I clutched the rifle to my chest, my knuckles white. My zombie survival story had just moved to the ground floor. The flight was over. The nightmare had just begun. I was no longer a scientist. I was a survivor. And I had to learn the rules of this new world fast, or I would be just another moaning corpse in the silent woods. The first night was the longest of my life. I didn't dare light a fire. I climbed a tall, sturdy pine tree near the crash site, wedging myself between two thick branches. The cold metal of the rifle a comfortless weight in my lap. The forest below was alive with them. The survivors from the plane, my former colleagues, shambled out of the wreckage. There were 4 of them, their forms twisted and broken from the crash, yet still moving. They were drawn to the flickering fires of the dying aircraft, their dark shapes silhouetted against the flames. Their movements were broken, unnatural. Their groans were a constant mournful chorus that echoed through the trees. Sleep was impossible. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I was living in a state of pure primal fear. When the sun finally rose, casting a weak gray light through the canopy, the groaning had subsided. The creatures had wandered off, dispersing into the woods like predators seeking new hunting grounds. I knew I couldn't stay. The crash site was a beacon. I had to move. I had to find shelter, supplies, and answers. What had happened to the world while I was in the sky? The city on the horizon was my only goal. It was a gamble. A city meant more people, which now meant more of them. But it also meant resources. I gathered the extra magazines for the rifle, stuffing them into the pockets of my torn flight suit. I took a compass from the survival kit and headed east, towards the smoke and the dead glow. The forest was eerily beautiful. Nature was already reclaiming the world, but signs of the fall were everywhere. A crashed car wrapped around a tree on a forgotten service road. A discarded backpack, its contents strewn across the ground. And bodies, so many bodies. Some were in their cars, others lying on the road. None of them had turned. It seemed the initial outbreak was airborne, a sudden, catastrophic event. You either died or you turned. There was no in-between. After a few hours of walking, the forest began to thin, giving way to the outskirts of a suburb. Manicured lawns were overgrown. Newspapers lay yellowing on driveways, and children's toys were scattered like forgotten memories. The silence here was different. It was heavier. It was the silence of absence. I moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows, the rifle held at the ready. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I saw my first ground dweller an hour later. It was a woman in a mail carrier's uniform, aimlessly bumping into a mailbox, one of her legs bent at a sickeningly wrong angle. She didn't see me. I flattened myself behind a hedge, my breath catching in my throat. This was the reality now. This was the zero-G zombie outbreak brought to Earth. My scientific mind tried to analyze, to categorize. What were their senses? Were they drawn to sound, sight, smell? I had to learn the rules. I found a small house with an open garage. I crept inside, the rifle's muzzle leading the way. The house was empty, abandoned in a hurry. A half-eaten meal was still on the table, covered in a thin layer of mold. In the garage, I found what I was looking for. A backpack, more rugged than the one I had. Canned food, bottles of water, a first aid kit far better than my own, and a map of the state. I spread it out on the hood of a dusty sedan. The town was called Harmony Creek, a bitter irony. According to the map, the city on the horizon was Denver. I was in the foothills of the Rockies. I also found a set of car keys hanging on a hook. I glanced at the sedan.
It was a long shot, but if it had gas. A noise from the street made me freeze. A low groan, closer this time. I peeked through the grimy garage window. The mail carrier was there, joined by two others. A man in a business suit and a teenage boy on a skateboard, or what was left of one. They were shuffling down the street, drawn by some unseen force. I had to make a decision. Stay here and risk being cornered, or make a run for it. I chose the latter. I needed to get out of these residential death traps. The highway was my best bet. I slipped out the back door of the house, my new backpack feeling heavy and secure. I moved through backyards, vaulting fences, my body aching in protest. I was a researcher, not an athlete, but fear is a powerful motivator.
I learned to be quiet. I learned to watch, to listen, to anticipate. The first day was a brutal education in the new science of survival. The world was a laboratory now, and every mistake was fatal. I was the only subject in my own desperate animated horror story, and the only passing grade was living to see another sunrise. For 3 days, I moved east. The suburbs bled into industrial parks, then into the sprawling, dead metropolis of Denver. The scale of the disaster was incomprehensible. Cars were piled up on the freeways, creating massive, silent blockades hundreds of feet high. The city was a graveyard, and the dead were walking its streets. I learned their patterns. They were mostly dormant during the cold nights, becoming more active as the sun warmed the day. They moved in herds, a slow, shambling tide of decay. Sound was the primary attractant. A car alarm, a falling piece of debris, a gunshot, all would draw them in from miles around. I hadn't fired my weapon yet. A single shot was a dinner bell I wasn't ready to ring. My survival depended on stealth and avoidance. I became a ghost, moving through the skeletal remains of civilization. On the 4th day, I found a haven. An electronics store, its metal security shutters mostly intact. I managed to pry one open just enough to squeeze through, then barricaded it from the inside with heavy shelves. The store was a treasure trove. Batteries, solar power chargers, and most importantly, radios. I spent hours tinkering, cannibalizing parts from different shortwave and ham radios, trying to build a long-range receiver. My hands, once skilled at manipulating delicate lab equipment, were now clumsy and raw, but my mind was sharp. I needed information. Was anyone else out there? Was there a government, an army, anything left? Late into the night, surrounded by the dead glow of the burning city filtering through the shutters, I got something. It was faint, buried in static, but it was a voice, a human voice. Repeating this broadcast on all emergency frequencies. This is Dr. Eleanor Vance from the CDC Emergency Response Center at Mount Weather. If anyone is hearing this, do not lose hope. My heart seized. I frantically adjusted the dials, my fingers trembling. The signal was weak, fading in and out. The pathogen, designated X19, is airborne and waterborne. Initial global saturation was near 100%, but there is a flaw in its design. It cannot survive long-term exposure to... The static crackled, swallowing her words. I slammed my fist on the table in frustration, then held my breath, praying. A specific protein sequence. We have synthesized a potential counteragent, a retrovirus that could neutralize X19 in living carriers and, theoretically, terminate reanimated subjects. We are calling it Janus. Janus, the two-faced god, looking to the past and the future. It was a scientist's name, a name of hope. We are broadcasting from the Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center in Virginia. We have other secure facilities, CDC outposts in Atlanta, Fort Collins. I scrambled for the map, my hands shaking. Fort Collins was just north of Denver, maybe 60 miles. It was a tangible destination, a purpose beyond just breathing for one more day. If you can hear this, do not attempt to reach us. The risk is too great. The herds are migrating. Stay sheltered. Stay hidden. We are working on a method of dispersal. We will not abandon you.
This is Dr. Vance signing off. The broadcast ended, replaced by the hiss of static. But it had been enough. Hope. It was a dangerous, intoxicating thing. For the first time since the world ended, I felt something other than fear. I felt a flicker of the man I used to be, the scientist, the problem solver. Dr. Vance didn't know what I knew. I had worked with X-19. I knew its properties, its weaknesses. I had the original research data stored on a hardened drive in my survival pack. That data could be the key. It could accelerate their work, save them months, maybe years. My knowledge was no longer a burden of guilt. It was a weapon. I had to get to Fort Collins. 60 miles of hell stood between me and that outpost. 60 miles of the walking dead. But now, I had a reason to walk it. I packed my gear with a renewed sense of urgency. The ghost of Harmony Creek was gone. In his place was Dr. Kenji Tanaka, and I had work to do. The journey north was a slow, grueling crawl through the arteries of a dead nation. I followed Interstate 25, a concrete river now choked with the wreckage of the last, panicked exodus from Denver. The sheer number of them was staggering. They clogged the roads, a relentless, shuffling mass of bodies that stretched for miles. I had to move through the wilderness that bordered the highway, a parallel journey through forests and fields. The rifle became an extension of my arm. I learned how to clean it, how to sight it, how to feel its balance. I still hadn't fired it. Every bullet was precious, and the cost of a single shot was too high. I survived on scavenged food and purified water, my body growing leaner, harder. The scientist's softness was burning away, replaced by a survivor's grit. I saw things that will haunt me forever. Herds so massive they looked like moving landscapes. Things that had once been children, their small forms lost in the shuffling crowds. The utter, brutal finality of the apocalypse was a constant companion. After 10 days of walking, I was less than a day's journey from Fort Collins.
I could see the city lights, real lights this time, a steady grid of power and life on the horizon. Hope was a physical thing, a warmth in my chest that fought back the cold dread. But the world had one more test for me. Between me and the city was Highway 9, and Highway 9 was blocked. It wasn't a traffic jam, it was a horde. The horde. The one Dr. Vance had warned about. It was a living ocean of the dead, stretching from horizon to horizon. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, all packed together, moving slowly, inexorably south. They filled the highway, the fields, the hills on either side. There was no going around it. It was a wall of death between me and my destination. I watched them from a ridge for hours, my binoculars pressed to my eyes. My scientific mind took over, analyzing, looking for a weakness. They were a collective, a hive mind of hunger. But they were stupid, predictable. Their path was straight. They flowed like water, following the path of least resistance. And then I saw it, a culvert, a large concrete drainage pipe that ran underneath the massive highway. It was a long shot. It would be dark, confined. If any of them were inside, I would be trapped. But it was the only way. Waiting for nightfall was my only option. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of blood and fire, the horde became a landscape of moaning silhouettes. The sound was a physical pressure, a deep, resonant hum of damnation that vibrated in my bones. I took a deep breath, the cold night air stinging my lungs. I checked my rifle, chambering around. The quiet days were over. I slid down the embankment, my boots sinking into the soft mud at the edge of the massive concrete pipe. The entrance was a black, gaping maw. The stench that wafted out was unimaginable. The smell of decay, of stagnant water, of death itself. This was it. Everything I had done, everyone I had lost, every painful step I had taken had led me to this dark, foul-smelling tunnel. 60 miles of hell were behind me. 1 mile of pure terror lay ahead. I took one last look at the lights of Fort Collins, a promise of a future. Then, clutching my rifle, I stepped out of the moonlight and into the absolute darkness of the culvert. The full-length horror story of my survival was reaching its climax, and I had no idea if I would live to see the final page. The darkness inside the culvert was absolute. It was a physical presence, pressing in on me, stealing my breath. The air was thick with the smell of rot and damp earth. I pulled a small hand-crank flashlight from my pack, its weak beam cutting a pathetic slice into the oppressive black. The tunnel was larger than I expected, maybe 8 feet in diameter, with a foot of stagnant, foul water covering the bottom. Every step was a sickening splash that echoed endlessly down the concrete tube. The sound of the horde above was a muffled, constant drumming, like the heartbeat of a dying giant. I moved slowly, one hand on the cold, slimy wall, the other holding the rifle. My flashlight beam danced ahead, revealing nothing but the endless, curving darkness. This was a primal fear, the kind that bypasses rational thought. I was in the belly of the beast. About 100 yards in, the beam caught something. A shape, pale and bloated, half submerged in the murky water. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. It was one of them. It must have fallen into a drainage ditch and been washed in. Its skin was waterlogged and sloughing off, its clothes a tattered mess. It was motionless, a drowner. I gave it a wide berth, pressing myself against the opposite wall, my feet sinking deeper into the silt. As I passed, its head lolled to the side, and a single milky eye seemed to follow me. I forced myself to keep moving, my breath held tight in my chest. Then I saw another, and another. The culvert was a tomb for the unlucky few who had been swept into the drainage system. They were trapped, preserved in this cold, dark place. Most were inert, but some stirred as my light passed over them, their groans low and waterlogged, like bubbles rising from a swamp. I had to be silent. I had to be invisible. The halfway point was marked by a central grate in the ceiling, a faint square of moonlight filtering down. It was clogged with debris, but the dim light was a relief. As I stood under it, catching my breath, I heard a sound that wasn't the horde above or the splashing of my own feet. It was a scraping sound, close by, in the dark. I swept my light around frantically. There, not 20 feet away, was one of them. It was different. It hadn't drowned. It was emaciated, its body contorted from being wedged in a side pipe. And it was active. It was crawling towards me, its fingernails scraping on the concrete, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. I couldn't shoot. The noise would echo for miles, drawing the horde down on this position, possibly collapsing the very ground I stood on. The crowbar. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and pulled the heavy iron bar from my pack. The creature lunged, surprisingly fast. I sidestepped in the shallow water, swinging the crowbar. It connected with its shoulder with a wet crunch. The thing barely registered the hit. It came at me again, jaws snapping. It was a desperate, clumsy dance in the dark. I stumbled backwards, my foot catching on a submerged rock. I fell, the filthy water splashing over me. The creature was on top of me in an instant, its weight pressing me down, its foul breath washing over my face. Its teeth, yellow and broken, snapped inches from my throat. I shoved the flashlight into its face, and it recoiled from the bright light, giving me a precious second. With all my strength, I brought the pointed end of the crowbar up, driving it into the base of its skull. There was a sickening crack. The creature went limp, its dead weight a crushing burden. I shoved it off, scrambling to my feet, shaking and covered in filth. My close call served as a brutal reminder. There is no such thing as a safe path in this world. I didn't stop again. I pushed forward, ignoring the pain, ignoring the fear, my eyes fixed on the faint promise of light at the far end of the tunnel. After what felt like an eternity, the circle of blackness ahead began to resolve into a circle of gray, the end of the tunnel. I emerged, gasping, into the pre-dawn light, collapsing onto the muddy bank. I was on the north side of the highway. The sound of the Horde was behind me now, a fading memory. I was alive. I was through. The land north of the highway was different, quieter. The Horde acted as a kind of filter, a moving wall that swept the landscape clean behind it. But quiet didn't mean safe. I spent the day moving through abandoned farmland, the skeletal remains of barns and silos standing like monuments to a forgotten time. Fort Collins was no longer a distant glow. It was a city I could see. But it wasn't the sanctuary I had imagined. As I got closer, I saw the barricades. Massive, crude walls made of shipping containers, wrecked cars and earth. There were watchtowers, manned by armed figures. This wasn't just a CDC outpost, it was a fortress. And fortresses have gates they don't like to open. Getting inside would be as hard as surviving the wilderness. I spent the night in a derelict farmhouse, watching the fortress through my binoculars. I saw searchlights sweeping the perimeter. I saw patrols moving in armored vehicles. This was an organized, disciplined operation. They weren't just surviving, they were holding the line. The next morning, I made my approach. I didn't try to sneak in. That would get me shot. I walked out into the open, my hands raised, the rifle slung visibly over my shoulder, muzzle down. It was the most vulnerable I had felt since the plane crash. It took them less than a minute. A spotlight pinned me, blinding me. A voice, amplified and distorted by a loudspeaker, boomed across the field. "Do not move. Stay where you are." An armored truck sped towards me, kicking up a cloud of dust. It screeched to a halt 50 feet away, and 4 soldiers in full tactical gear disembarked, their rifles trained on my chest. "On your knees, hands on your head," the lead soldier yelled. I complied slowly, my heart pounding. This was it. They could kill me right here, and no one would ever know. 2 of them advanced, their movements professional and efficient. They kicked my rifle away, patted me down, and zip-tied my hands behind my back with brutal efficiency. "Who are you? Where did you come from?" the leader asked, his face hidden behind a helmet and goggles. "My name is Dr. Kenji Tanaka," I said, my voice hoarse. "I was a researcher. My plane crashed west of Denver. I have information, vital information for the CDC." The soldier stared at me for a long moment. I could feel his skepticism, his suspicion. In this world, a stranger was just a threat. "He says he's a doctor," he said into his radio, his voice flat. "Got a data drive on him. Looks like he's been through hell." There was a crackle of static. Then a new voice came over the radio. A woman's voice. Calm, authoritative. "Bring him in. Quarantine protocol. And bring the drive." The soldiers hauled me to my feet and pushed me towards the truck. As they drove me towards the massive gate, I got my first real look at the city. It wasn't a city anymore. It was a camp. A refugee camp built in the ruins of a university campus. Tents, makeshift shelters, and the gaunt faces of survivors. This wasn't the hope I was looking for. This was just a larger, more organized version of the nightmare I'd been living. Quarantine was a small, windowless room made of concrete. They stripped me of my gear, gave me a rough decontamination shower that felt like being sandblasted, and left me with a set of gray scrubs and a bottle of water. I was alone for 24 hours. The silence was a different kind of prison. After the constant threat of the outside, the sterile emptiness of the room was unnerving. I had made it, but I had no idea if I had traded one cage for another. The next day, the door opened. A man in a lab coat, flanked by 2 guards, entered. He was older, with tired eyes and a grim set to his mouth. "I'm Dr. Peters," he said, not offering a hand. "I'm head of intake pathology. We've run a preliminary analysis on the blood we took from you. You're clean." I felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled my knees. For weeks I had lived with the fear that I was a ticking time bomb, that the X-19 I inhaled on the plane was gestating inside me. The filtration system on my O2 mask must have held, I murmured. You're lucky, Peter said, unimpressed. Most aren't. Now, about this drive of yours. You claim to have original research on X-19. Our people are trying to decrypt it now. They say it's heavily coded. It's my own encryption, I said. I can give you access. Peters raised an eyebrow. Dr. Vance will want to speak with you.
She's the one in charge of the Janus Project. They led me out of quarantine and through the facility. It was the Colorado State University campus, transformed. The main science building was the heart of the operation, a fortress within the fortress. Wires and cables snaked across the floors. Labs that were once used for veterinary science were now level 4 biohazard containment zones. Everyone moved with a purpose, their faces etched with exhaustion and stress. This was humanity's last stand, and it was being fought by tired scientists and soldiers. The scale of the operation was staggering. They had power, running water, a semblance of order, but the resources were clearly finite. I saw patched equipment, ration lines, and the constant, weary tension of a community under siege. This sanctuary was fragile, a tiny island of light in an ocean of darkness. They took me to an office on the top floor. A woman stood by a large window overlooking the compound, her back to me. Dr. Tanaka, she said, turning around. It was the voice from the radio. Dr. Eleanor Vance. She was younger than I expected, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through me. I've read the initial report. A zero-G research flight. An extremophile microbe from a meteorite. It sounds like science fiction. I assure you, the consequences are very real, I said. So I've seen, she replied, her gaze distant. Your drive. My technicians say they can't crack it without wiping it. They say you're the only one who can open it. That's correct, I said, and I will. But I need to know what I'm walking into. What is the Janus Project? What have you found? Vance stared at me, a long, calculating look. She was weighing me, judging me. The Janus Project, she said finally, is our only hope of taking back the world. And according to your data, it might already be doomed to fail. Eleanor Vance was not a woman who wasted words. She led me to a terminal in her office, and I quickly decrypted my research drive. As the files loaded, terabytes of sequencing data, protein folding simulations, cellular interaction logs, I could see a flicker of something in her eyes. Awe, hunger. This was the raw, unfiltered data from the source of the plague. For a scientist, it was the Rosetta Stone of the apocalypse. We've been working with degraded samples recovered from the field, she explained, her voice low as she scrolled through the files. We've been flying blind, making assumptions. This is the whole genome, the original strain. She explained the situation. The X-19 pathogen had spread globally through the upper atmosphere, carried on the jet streams, coming down in the rain. The initial saturation was, as the broadcast said, nearly total. Billions died in the first 72 hours. Some people, a tiny fraction of the population, had a natural immunity, a specific genetic marker that allowed their bodies to fight off the infection. The rest either died or turned. The Janus retrovirus is designed to deliver that genetic sequence, she said, pointing to a complex model on her screen. It rewrites the host's DNA to produce the immunity protein. In a living, uninfected person, it's a vaccine. In an infected person, it should, theoretically, halt the reanimation process and terminate the subject. Terminate? I asked. It triggers total cellular collapse. The bodies liquefy. It's not pretty, but it's effective at neutralizing the threat, she said grimly. We've tested it on captured subjects. It works, but we can't produce enough of it. The Fort Collins facility was one of only 3 major CDC operations left in North America, the others being in Atlanta and a heavily fortified bunker in Alaska. They were all working on the same problem, but communication was sporadic. Mount Weather, the command center she had broadcast from, had gone silent 2 weeks ago. They were on their own. Your data on the zero-G catalysis is the missing piece, she continued, her excitement palpable. We couldn't understand why the pathogen was so hyper-aggressive. We thought it was a simple prion disease. But you're telling me it's an alien catalyst that uses the host's own cellular machinery to create, what, a new life form? It's a biological machine, I said, the horror of it all fresh in my mind. In zero-G, it was building, regenerating. On the ground, under the stress of gravity, it seems to be focused on propagation and aggression. It's adapting. It's learning. A cold look passed over Vance's face. That's what we were afraid of. We've seen variations in the field. Some are faster. Some seem to be developing rudimentary pack-hunting behaviors. The horde you bypassed? That's new. They've never been that organized before. My blood ran cold. The microbe wasn't just a mindless plague. It was an evolving enemy. I need you in the lab, Kenji, she said, using my first name for the first time. I need your eyes on this. You understand X-19 better than anyone left alive. You can help us refine Janus, maybe speed up the production process. For the first time since the crash, I felt a sense of purpose that wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption. What do you need me to do? I asked. Vance smiled, a thin, tired smile. Welcome to the CVC, Dr. Tanaka. Let's get to work saving the world. The next few weeks were a blur of relentless work. I was given a small room in the derricks and a lab coat that felt like a ghost of my former life. The Janus Project lab was the most secure part of the facility, a place of humming servers, bubbling beakers, and the quiet intensity of scientists racing against extinction. I was an outsider, the man who was present at creation, and the team treated me with a mixture of suspicion and respect. My primary collaborator was a man named Dr. Marcus Thorne, no relation to Eris, a cruel irony I thought about daily. Marcus was a brilliant, cynical geneticist who had lost his family in the initial outbreak in Atlanta. He saw Janus not as a cure, but as a weapon. "We're not saving anyone, Kenji," he told me one night over a cup of terrible coffee. "We're sterilizing the planet. This isn't medicine, it's pest control." His cynicism was a counterpoint to Vance's fierce optimism, but I knew he was right in a way. The world I knew was gone. We weren't rebuilding it, we were just trying to make the ruins habitable. My data was a breakthrough. The full genomic sequence of the original X-19 strain allowed them to understand its replication cycle in minute detail. We discovered its primary weakness, cobalt. The microbe used iron in the blood to replicate, but it had a high affinity for cobalt, which acted as a poison to its strange cellular structure. "We can bond a cobalt isotope to the retrovirus," Marcus proposed, his eyes alight with discovery. "It won't just deliver the immunity protein, it will be a targeted poison. It could increase the termination efficacy by a factor of 10. It was a brilliant, terrifying idea. We were designing a silver bullet for a monster of our own making. We worked day and night, fueled by caffeine and desperation. I watched as our simulations ran, as the modified Janus retrovirus, which we dubbed Janus Cobalt, proved devastatingly effective in tissue cultures. We were on the verge of a true counteragent, something that could be dispersed as an aerosol and wipe out entire herds. Hope, once a faint signal on a radio, was becoming a tangible thing. But as I dove deeper into my own data, I found something I had missed in my initial analysis on the plane: an anomaly. A secondary replication pathway in the X-19 genome, a dormant set of instructions. "What is this?" Marcus asked, looking over my shoulder at the sequence. "It looks like a defensive protocol, a response to environmental stress." I ran a simulation, inputting the Janus Cobalt agent as the environmental stressor. The results made my stomach clench. The dormant genes activated. The microbe began to change, to adapt. It started encasing itself in a crystalline protein shell, impervious to the cobalt.
Worse, it began to integrate with the host's nervous system on a much deeper level. "What does this mean?" Vance asked when we showed her the data. I took a deep breath. "It means we have a very limited window. The moment we deploy Janus Cobalt, the pathogen will begin to evolve. It will create a new strain, something harder to kill, something smarter. The flaw in the cure wasn't a side effect. It was a built-in obsolescence. We could win a single massive battle against the dead, but it would be the first shot in a new war against an enemy that was learning to think. The revelation sent a shockwave through the Janus Project. Our silver bullet would create a new, armor-plated monster. We were in an arms race with a microbe. The debate in the command center was fierce. The military commander of the facility, a pragmatic but ruthless colonel named Ava Rostova, wanted to deploy Janus Cobalt immediately. "We take out the millions of them at our gates now," she argued, her voice sharp. "We deal with the smarter ones later. We're losing 2 or 3 patrols a week. The walls won't hold forever. We need to thin the herd." Vance was opposed. "If we do this, we lose our one advantage. We'll be fighting an enemy that can adapt to our only weapon. We need to find a way to neutralize the evolved strain before we even think about deployment." "And how long will that take, Doctor?" Rostova shot back. "Months? Years? We don't have that long. Look at the supply reports. We have 3 months of food left, 6 months of fuel for the generators. This place is a ticking clock." I was caught in the middle. My data was the source of both their hope and their despair. I worked feverishly, running simulations, searching for another weakness in the evolved strain. There wasn't one. The crystalline shell was biologically inert. The deeper integration with the nervous system suggested the new infected would be more coordinated, their movements less random. They would retain some semblance of their host's motor skills. They wouldn't just shamble, they would run. They would climb. They would hunt. The weight of my responsibility was crushing. Eris had unleashed the plague, but I was the one who had brought the knowledge of it here. I felt like a modern-day Prometheus, bringing a fire that would either save humanity or burn it to ashes. One evening, I found Vance alone in the observation deck, looking out at the endless sea of the dead that surrounded the campus. The horde I had bypassed had not dispersed. It had been drawn here, to the biggest source of light, sound, and life for 100 miles. "We're going with Rostova's plan," she said without looking at me. "We're going to start mass production of Janus Cobalt tomorrow. We'll load it into crop duster drones. We're going to hit the horde in 3 days." "Eleanor, you can't," I pleaded.
"It's a death sentence for the future. The future is already dead if that wall falls, Kenji," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of command. "I have to choose between a chance to survive now or the certainty of dying tomorrow. It's not a choice. There has to be another way." "There isn't," she said, finally turning to face me. Her eyes were filled with a terrible resolve. "We are out of time. We are making our stand here, win or lose. Pray that we win, Kenji. Because if we lose, the things that come next will make the ones out there look like a mercy." The decision was made. The clock was ticking down to 0 hour. We were about to cure the disease by creating an even deadlier one. And I had a sickening feeling that the walls weren't going to hold for 3 more days. The feeling was a premonition. The attack came 2 days later, at dusk. It wasn't a slow, mindless push against the walls like usual. It was coordinated. It began with a sound, a high-pitched, piercing shriek that echoed across the plains. It wasn't a sound I had ever heard from them before. It was a signal. In response, the horde surged, but not everywhere at once. They focused their entire mass on a single point, the northern barricade, the weakest section, constructed from old city buses and shipping containers. It was intelligent. It was a tactic. "They're communicating," I said in horror, watching the monitors in the command center with Vance and Rostova. The evolved ones, they must already be out there, leading them. Rostova was already barking orders into her radio, dispatching all reserve units to the northern wall. The sound of gunfire erupted, a constant, desperate chatter. For an hour, the line held. The soldiers fought with grim determination, a wall of lead against a tide of flesh. But the sheer pressure was too much. With a groan of tortured metal, one of the buses buckled. It was all they needed. The dead poured through the gap, a flood of grasping hands and snapping teeth. The first line of defenders was swarmed, their screams cut short over the radio. Alarms blared across the compound. All non-essential personnel to the science building. Seal the blast doors, Rostova commanded, her voice strained but steady. The fortress was breached. The sanctuary was falling. Chaos erupted in the compound as people ran for the relative safety of the main building. I ran with them, my heart pounding. I saw a soldier fall, dragged down by 3 of them. I saw a scientist I recognized from the cafeteria get cornered against a wall. There was no time to help. It was pure survival. I made it to the science building just as the massive steel blast doors were closing. I squeezed through the gap, turning to see the horde flooding the central plaza. And I saw them. The new strain. They were faster, moving with a terrifying, loping gait. They weren't shambling, they were running. One of them scaled a wall with unnatural agility, pulling itself onto a low roof. They were hunters. We were sealed inside, but we all knew it was a temporary reprieve. The building had its own generators and life support, but it was now a tomb. The horde was outside, and hundreds, maybe thousands, were already inside the perimeter fence. "They're at the doors," a soldier reported over the comms. A heavy, rhythmic booming sound echoed through the building. They were trying to break down the last barrier. "Vance, how much of the Janus cobalt is ready?" Rostova asked, her face grim in the red emergency lighting. "1 drone's worth," Vance replied, her voice shaking slightly. "Enough to clear the plaza, maybe, but we can't launch it from in here." "There's a rooftop access hatch," Rostova said. "Manual release. Someone has to get up there and fly it." It was a suicide mission. Whoever went would be exposed, with no way back inside. The command center was silent. Everyone looked at each other, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Who would be the sacrifice? I looked at the data on my screen, at the monster I helped create, and the cure that would unleash something worse. The guilt was a physical weight. "I'll do it," I said. All eyes turned to me. I started this, on that plane. I should be the one to finish it. Vance stepped forward. "No, Kenji, your knowledge is too valuable." "What's the value of my knowledge if we're all dead in the next hour?" I countered. "Give me a sidearm and show me the way." There was no more time to argue. The booming on the doors was getting louder. The metal was beginning to groan. Rostova gave me her pistol. It felt heavier than the rifle ever had. She and Vance led me through a series of maintenance corridors, the sound of the assault on the blast doors a constant, deafening thunder. We reached a ladder leading to the roof hatch. "The drone is prepped," Vance said, her hands gripping a tablet. "Once you're clear, I'll activate the launch sequence from here. You just need to get it into the air and paint the target area. It will do the rest." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a conflict of emotions. "You gave us a chance, Kenji. Thank you." I just nodded, unable to speak. I climbed the ladder, Rostova covering me from below. I pushed the hatch open and scrambled onto the roof. The world was a vision of hell. The compound below was a swirling mass of the dead. The shrieks of the new, faster infected cut through the groans of the horde. Fires burned, casting a flickering, apocalyptic glow on the scene. The drone, a modified agricultural quadcopter with a large tank in the center, sat waiting. I ran to it, my hands fumbling with the release clamps. A new shriek, close by, made me look up. One of the new variants was on the roof of the adjacent building. It saw me. It crouched, then leaped across the gap, landing on the roof with a sickening crunch of gravel. It was fast, so much faster than the others. I raised Rostova's pistol, my hand shaking. I fired, once, twice. The first shot went wide, the second hit it in the shoulder, barely slowing it down. It lunged. I fired again, a point-blank shot to the head. The thing collapsed at my feet. I didn't waste a second. I hit the final release on the drone. Its rotors whirred to life with a high-pitched whine. "It's away!" I yelled into the small radio they'd given me. "I see it," Vance's voice crackled back. "Targeting, now." The drone lifted into the air, hovering over the plaza. Then, a fine mist began to descend from it, catching the firelight like a silver rain. For a moment, nothing happened. The horde continued to surge, oblivious. Then, the screaming began. It was a new sound, a sound of dissolution. The infected began to collapse, to melt. Their bodies dissolved into a black, bubbling sludge, the Janus retrovirus doing its horrific, efficient work. The plaza was clearing. It was working. A path was opening up from the science building to the main gate. "There's an armored vehicle in the motor pool," Rostova's voice came over the radio, tight with urgency. "We're going to make a run for it. We can't hold this facility. We're taking your data and the Janus prototype. Get to the east wall. We'll pick you up on the outside." I looked down at the chaos. The drone was empty now, its silver rain spent. The horde was decimated, but more were pouring in from the breach. And I could see more of the fast ones, the evolved strain, intelligently avoiding the mist, watching, learning. This was not a victory. It was a retreat. I ran to the edge of the roof and used a service ladder to get down to the ground outside the main building. I was alone, in the dark, with the sounds of the dying and the damned. I ran, my lungs burning, the pistol clutched in my hand. I reached the east wall and threw myself over it, landing hard on the other side. Moments later, the armored truck burst through the main gate, its machine gun firing, clearing a path. The back ramp lowered, and Vance's hand reached out for me. I grabbed it, and she pulled me inside. The ramp closed, plunging us into the red-lit interior. Besides Vance and Rostova, there were only 3 others. Marcus Thorne, the cynical geneticist, and 2 soldiers. That was it. The entire hope for humanity, packed into a steel box, fleeing the ruins of our last best hope. As the truck sped away into the darkness, leaving the fallen fortress of Fort Collins behind, I felt a familiar sensation, a feeling of falling, of being trapped in a metal container, hurtling towards an unknown fate. It was just like the plane. A new parabola had begun. We had the cure, and we had the poison. We had the knowledge of the enemy, an enemy that was now evolving to hunt us. We were fugitives, carrying the last flickering flame of human knowledge. And I had a new, terrible question to answer. What is the cost of a single life when weighed against billions? And what do you do when you're the one who has to pay the price?